Hey everyone, and welcome back to another round of Spore Viewer Creations Reborn, where you submit your favourite creations and I try to remake them. For the very first creation of the day, we have the Gravity Balls by Spaceshard2319. This was an interesting creature to start with, as it had a very scorpion-like body, and that is something that I've yet to really approach in this series so far, so it made for a nice change of pace. However, when it came to the legs, the feet had an interesting part from the Strange and Beautiful mod pack, which is a mod I don't personally use very often, but I did notice about how the feet looked rather reptilian. They had large claws, so I decided to replace my feet with some vanilla reptilian claws, and otherwise tried to keep the leg posturing and arms slightly similar. In the end, I did pull the furthest hind legs back a bit more because they just looked a bit more visually interesting with a much larger, much kind of broader silhouette overall. I also replaced some of the limbs with the exoskeleton limbs from Replicant because I have just been falling in love with these limbs lately. They're just such a nice texture, have a really nice shape, and it's so great to use them in such a way where they actually inherit the base color of the creature, so they actually flow together without being the regular, really strange kind of murky coloration the original exoskeleton limbs are. For the head, I had to try get creative. So again, the Strange and Beautiful head. It has these interesting, I want to say, very large cheeks, if you will, probably like chitinous cheeks on either side of the mandibles, and I don't really have any head like that from Dark Injection, from Vanilla, Creepy and Cute, etc. So I had to try and use one of the more insectoid Dark Injection heads and just kind of slap on some giant detail parts flipped over. So it just looks like it's got these large chitinous cheeks. Later on, I also add a little bit more mass to it as well. That way it really looks like just a much larger form around the mouth. And when it came to the body and armor, I really didn't want to leave it empty. Since this would remind me of a scorpion, I like the idea of it having like a fairly large, harsh armored body. And after a bit of experimenting with different parts, I decided to settle down with the bone knee pads from Spore because they're just great. They're such a classic they can't really go wrong with. They got a nice repeating pattern that looks satisfying when you stack it up, and I lined it with additional nail downs as well, just to overall give more noise. And after a while, I also took one of the Creepy and Cute parts, flipped them over, as the underside of it has a really nice, interesting bumpy surface, and I used that to accentuate the upper armor and even make it look like that his armor was kind of overlapping on top of the limbs and giving an entire new dynamic to the creature. And then of course, obligatory keratin horns, I added a couple of those onto the head, onto the elbows, and onto all the knees. And then when it came to the color scheme, I tried to use something pretty much the same as the previous original, just a little bit more vibrant, a bit more varied, and otherwise I'm really happy with how this first creation came out. It certainly is a thing that I don't make enough insectoid creatures, and this here was a great bit of practice. Speaking of unusual creatures, next up we had the Cavalot by Finbot24. The Cavalot was an interesting, very mirrored creature, and this is something I utterly have no experience with, and it was especially tricky trying to think of a way to kind of refresh this and make mine different to the original. So when it came to the legs, I tried to make the legs a little bit more musculature. I added an extra joint to them to make them look a little bit more dynamic, and otherwise tried to mirror them back and forth the same way, just like in the original creation. It took a little bit of nitpicking, and once again obligatory exoskeleton limbs from Replicant for the extra texturing, and then I elected to cover the legs in spikes because for me, when in doubt, add spikes. They just seem to help creations a lot, I find. So when it came to the arms, I tried to do the same thing once again, and that was create another pattern of repeating or mirrored limbs, just like the original. It had a very interesting, almost umbrella-like posture, so I did indeed try to replicate that. I didn't want to deviate too far from the original, while it wasn't something that I really normally make. And to keep my design consistent, I added a couple more keratin horns along the arms, just like I did the legs. And once I added in the head, it came to a point where I was a little bit stuck. I really wasn't sure how to further add to this, but it was really giving me the vibes of some kind of organic tree. I say organic, I mean like a big tree monster, or like an elemental, something that can actually physically move around. So I decided to add a bunch of plating. along the body, very reminiscent to that of which you might see on a pine cone. So then, continuing with the earlier thought of perhaps a large movable plant, maybe a carnivorous plant, I decided to add a couple of vines or tendrils around the head. And then at that point, I have to be honest, I didn't really know what else to add, and I feel really guilty about this, so Finbot, I'm so sorry. It's a really interesting creature design. I just really struggle with this kind of symmetrical thing. It's why you see me making so many animals. When it comes to more monstrous designs, my mind just goes blank. But nonetheless, I did really try this one. I at the very least just tried to give it a little bit more anatomy and a little bit more feature. So I do hope it is an enjoyable reborn nonetheless. For the third creation of the video, we have our obligatory dragon, and that is King Cyriops by Swaggerist Omega Squid. What I liked about King Cyriops, which I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, was that it had a very kingly look. Something about the wings and the bipedal stance, having a proper bipedal stance or humanoid stance, and the large draping wings, kind of look like a cloak, and it just really helped with the whole kingly design. So I thought this would be like a nice, interesting one to make. Obviously, I've made plenty of dragons, and yes, I made plenty of humanoid or bipedal dragons, but something about this one just felt a little bit different. I think it was the body shape, which I tried to capture in mine, and that included giving the lad a little bit of fat as well, the choice of feet and the sickle claw, and the very interesting graspers, which is very unusual and something that I was quite looking forward to trying, since again, it's just very different parts. It's a dragon, but it's not quite a traditional dragon. Then when it came to the head was basically that of a Triceratops. So I went with my usual Triceratops technique. However, I did add in a couple of extra keratin horns along the frill, kind of like that of a Styracosaurus, just to make it look a little bit more interesting. I gave him some large pecs because I was otherwise feeling a little bit too round, shall I say, which in a Spore creation can cause it to look a little bit boring. So I just sort of like giving it some pecs, some large shoulders, which just help kind of break apart the smoothness a bit. The tail I richly adored in horror lumps because I just wanted it to look kind of grand, a bit more spiky and larger than before, as Swaggerth's original creation did have a spiky tip to the tail, but not very much. It was just a very long, thin tail, so I wanted to give mine a little bit more mass, especially to help compensate what was about to be some very large wings. I then proceeded to use the same horror lump technique all along the back and neck as well, because of course, me and my dragons, it's got to have little spikes onto it. And then after a little bit of experimenting with the wings, I decided to try out a very old technique from classic Spore called Spore that I'm actually not very good at myself. And this technique is to utilize exoskeleton limbs and to pull party fowl and other various vanilla parts to try and manually piece together some wings. Now, this is definitely a much more complicated technique, and sometimes if you do it well, it can look absolutely fantastic. And there are some creators out there who really excel this technique. I am not one of them, but I thought it'd be a fitting try for this creation nonetheless, because my other techniques weren't really working, and I wanted a very large cloak-like structure. Now, in the end, whether or not I got cloak-like is to be determined, but I am quite happy with my result nonetheless, especially just the way they kind of flow outwards away from the body as if they're being draped along the floor. And I feel like that's a nice, large, fitting set of wings to suit that of a king. And then for the colour scheme, I opted to make it pretty much the same as the original, just a little bit brighter and a little bit richer. For the fourth creation, we had the Razor Mouth by Veteran Rays. I struggled in this one as well. It's a common theme of this particular video. I struggled on a lot of these creations. So when it came to this creation, I didn't really like the hunched over posture. It's a very kind of classic, you know, obvious self-staged creature stage, transient creature that I'm not really a big fan of. I just think the posturing's a bit meh. So I tried to make my one a little bit more bipedal, like as if it's gonna step up and it's somewhat evolving. But honestly, in my first iteration of this, I just got stuck. I think it was the saw blades around the mouth. The saw blades are one of my least favorite parts. They're a cool looking parts, but they're incredibly niche and unusual to use. And seeing them around the mouth, it just kind of really knocked me off my feet, and I didn't really know what to do with it. At this point, I was also a little bit burnt out, so in the end I decided to pause this creation, go away for a couple of days, come back, and the next iteration was much better. For the next one, I had instant inspiration. I went again with a slightly more bipedal, well not bipedal, but overall more raptor-like, more evolved stance. And then instead of using the saw blades, I wanted to still have a very large, intimidating, spiky mouth pincer thing, and my one kind of just made itself up. I used exoskeleton limbs for the actual structure, and then I very carefully placed each keratin horn in such a way where it just kind of helps with both function and form, where lots of them are along the pincers in such a way where it looks like it can grab or crush or tear, and then a couple of more just around the back or around the base just for additional decoration, and overall making this really front heavy, terrifying mouth complex. And I think that just looks so much better than my earlier attempt of trying to use or utilize the saw blades part. I'm a lot happier with this iteration, but now that I have so many claws along the mouth, which even for me, I have to admit, was a bit excessive, I wanted to try and mimic this along the rest of the body. I really don't like it when creations just have a ton of features in one spot, completely isolated and looking out of place from the rest, so I wanted to make sure that my use of keratin horns was fairly consistent, so I added a couple of more chunky ones in various places throughout. Now, another feature I ended up completely remaking were the wings. The original Razormouth had butterfly wings, and while I appreciated a more insectoid theme, the butterfly wings, they just weren't doing it for me. So instead for my one, I I suppose my wings look more like a display than they do functional, but I elected to use some exoskeletal limbs to create a frame, use the finiest parts just to create the membrane, and left it at that. Not every creature needs big crazy wings to look cool. I thought in this case a threat display was probably going to be the better option. And now that the creature was looking pretty large, heavy and sturdy, it was time to finish that by adding various nail downs all along the body and a little pair of acorns around the face as tribute to the original one, in addition to some antlers in the form of antenna. Now when it came to the colour scheme, I made my one a bit more vivid, though not necessarily brighter, more darker, but just a little bit more intense. Since the original creation did have bright colours, and I didn't want to step away from that. So I like to think of mine resembles somewhat that of certain colourful beetles or just more vibrantly coloured insects, and leave it with that. It definitely did end up as a rather interesting lad, and I am just really proud of the face and the mandibles. And then for the fifth creation of the day, we had the Gullah Rook by Papa Morgan. Now, Papa Morgan's creation here, it looks beautiful. It's a really cool take on some kind of rose elemental or vine creature. And once again, the constant theme of this video, and this is something I've not really done much before, so this was once again a brand new take, a brand new concept in general. And Papa Morgan's one just looked awesome, so I really wasn't sure how to add upon this. So I figured, instead of trying to improve it, I wanted to try and evolve it. It's clearly a flower-themed creature, so I imagined what if mine was to be blooming more, perhaps even overgrown. And that's exactly what I did. The petal technique that Papa Morgan used for their creation's face is beautiful. I've never really seen anything like it before, and I hope to use this more myself in the future. It really did outline just how useful the dark injection variant of this particular Dora visor part is, since it textures differently and it comes out to such a nice vibrant colour, and it's perfect for petals. So I tried to utilise that, but also combine it with the vanilla Dora visor part as well to give it a bit of variation. The body I made more or less the same. Perhaps it's a little bit bulkier, but I really wanted to keep that kind of slack, hunched forward posture. But in the end for mine, I pretty much just started adding just plenty more leaves, plenty more vines. After a while, it got to a point where I was just really enjoying just how the silhouette was kind of growing outwards, where it wasn't necessarily a large creature, it just had a lot of thin, spindly bits coming out, and I really was liking that. Like I said, I wanted an overgrown design. When it came to the tail, I initially didn't want the tail to be wrapped around the front like Papa Morgan's was. I thought that'd be a bit of a lazy copy-paste. So I was going to try and have mine swirl around in the background behind it, but then I thought, that's just going to get easily missed and a bit boring. So in the end, since we are again going the whole overgrowth theme, I decided, you know what, I'll do the same as Papa Morgan and have the tail at the front, but I'll have two tails, will simply be two of them, but a nice bit of symmetry, have even more vines and such growing out of them, randomly placed flowers all over the place, and made the colours just a bit more vibrant, a little bit darker, as if the look is a bit more matured, or gone out of control. And in the end, for a creation that I wasn't convinced I was going to be able to do much justice, I am quite proud of how my one came out. It's definitely a distinct change, but one where I hope really makes sense. Now this one being our fifth creation of the video means it is also our Zedbrush sculpt. And this one got a ton of votes from the community, so I really hope you guys like how this one came out. When it came to bringing this Spore creation into Zedbrush, my immediate priority was to separate all the parts. I wanted the vines to be a different part, I wanted the hands and feet to be detached, the flowers, the tail, absolutely everything, so that I could have full control of this and work on this in stages. And after separation was complete, the first thing I did with this one is completely remake the petals around the face. And this in itself was quite a timely process, since after I completed the shape of the first petal, I was happy with the way it was going to be. I then had to try and just place that all over the place, place it meticulously, but hopefully not too repetitive or too clean, because after all, flowers are a little bit random. I wanted mine to be a lot more densely packed, and I think I kind of got away with keeping the symmetry. Now once I was overall happy with the pattern of the petals, it was then time to work on the vines on the back. So bearing in mind, I did this without any references, I was just kind of like guessing flower anatomy as I was going on. And the first thing I did was try and make a bit of a base, stem, root, I'm not sure what to call it, that holds the back of the flower itself. And that's how it brings everything together, and it makes a bit more sense as to how the head attaches onto the neck and body. Then I chopped off the original petals, the original head on the creature, did a high dynamesh, and kind of just blurred everything together, as I mentioned I often do earlier. Since I was really happy with the base body of this creature, I like the big arms, I like the tree trunk legs, I like the leaves coming out of its body, so I wanted to keep it all there and then just add a bit of a fur texture to simulate that of roots or any sort of barky, naturally texture along the body. Now earlier I isolated the tail away from the creature. I was considering remaking it entirely, but I ended up keeping roughly the original tail shape, just making it a little bit thinner, a little bit more curvy compared to the Spore variant. paint, and then I duplicated it, chopped it in half, and used a copy to add a couple of extra tendrils along the tail, since I didn't like how it just randomly split down the middle of the tail, but at the same time, I didn't want it to have two tails. I wanted to have a split tail. So I figured, alright then, adding a couple of more splits would help kind of cement that feeling and make it make sense, which I think it did in the end. And then when it came to the various vines, I once again decided to stick with the original Spore version, because it makes the parts look rather elegant, and doing like thin spirals in Zedbrush, that does actually take quite a while, whereas I already have it here in Spore. I already have it, it looks good, I like the way it's proportioned, I like all the lengths and sizes. All I had to do was kind of just move each individual vine around to make sure its base fits back onto the Spore creation, since a couple of things got moved around in translation. And again, same with the hands. I just really like the style of the hands that Papa Morgan first used in their creation, so again, I kind of kept it here in mind. In the end, the sculpt was more about just cleaning up and refining the Spore creation, since as opposed to creatures like animals, normally their faces and musculature are very bulbous, so there's a lot to fix and tidy up. But in the case of this one, the base anatomy was honestly pretty good. The details are pretty good. Everything just kind of flowed the way I wanted it to in Spore, and there wasn't really much to change in Zedbrush, just again, cleaning it up and adding a little bit of extra detail. When it came to the colorations, just like both of the creations, I wanted it to be mossy green, but a bit more of a vibrant green. Now thankfully, thanks to the cavity setting, I was able to outline just the upper tip of every root and texture. That way it looked like it had a dark undercoating, but a nice light dry brushing edge. However, after a while, it got a little bit boring of just how it was all only constantly green. So I elected to add a bit of brown, and not only to the legs and the arms, but just a little bit all over the place, just so the vines themselves look like they're a little bit discolored in a few places, as I think it just looks a lot more natural, a lot more appealing to the eye. I wanted to go with a very vibrant fuchsia, red, pink, what have you for the petals, including all the little flowers, and also for the tips of a lot of the vines as well. Since again, I wanted the colours to be prominent all over the place and not just isolated to one or two areas, since that to me does make for a bit of an odd coloration. And then once I added a bit of colour variety to the flower head in the forms of various splotches of lighter pink, darker pink, a little bit of white, a little bit of black, etc. I did the same to the rest of the body as well, since in my creation, I liked how it had a bit of a spotted texture. I wanted to try and translate that into this, and I think I did a decent job at it. And in the end, absolutely loving the Zedbrush sculpt. Definitely unlike anything I've really drawn before, and it's really cool just to see how it looks here in Zedbrush, all nice and bright and vibrant. And it definitely makes me want to try more wispy, viney, tendril-like creatures or concepts in the future. And then of course that brings us to the end of this episode. Congratulations to everyone, and thank you all so much once again for taking part. This has been a wonderful episode of trial and error, trying new things, and absolutely leaving my comfort zone, and I hope it's proved to be a bit of inspiration to some people, or at the very least entertaining. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all again next time. Cheers.